In this video, we're going to talk about Mark Doty's poem, A Display of Mackerel. This is one of my favorite poems. Don't give me a poem about somebody wandering through a field of daffodils. Don't give me a poem about a raging thunderstorm or a beautiful sunset or the nature of goodness and evil. Give me a poem about dead fish displayed in a grocery store. What I really like about the poem is that you can read it and just appreciate the images. They're beautiful, but they're also really relatable and mundane. But you can also read this poem as a meditation, and we'll get to that when we get to the end of the poem. I asked you to answer a few questions about the poem. Obviously, the questions were more in-depth, but just to kind of remind you, I asked you to think about how the fish is a metaphor, how the mackerel represents something else, or what's going on with the mackerel, the imagery of the poem and the effect of this imagery, how form and content connect. We might look at things like enjambment or the structure of stanzas. So how is form and content, how are those not two separate things, but how are they one and the same? I asked you to notice the scholastic or kind of schoolhouse kindergarten type of words in one particular stanza near the end of the poem. Then I'd also like you to connect some of the themes of this poem to I'm Nobody, Who Are You, the Emily Dickinson poem that we read right before this one, and then also Mirror by Sylvia Plath, which also has a fish image at the end, but her fish is very different than the mackerel you see in this poem. So we'll try to discuss this and answer some of these questions along the way. Let's go through. I want to focus on a few key points in each stanza. They lie in parallel rows on ice, head to tail, each a foot of luminosity. So there's no period at the end of that stanza, but I'm just going to pause here for a moment. Notice how the poem begins with a pronoun, they. Now, we see from the title that he's probably referencing mackerel, but it's still noteworthy that he begins with they and not a proper noun. I think somehow using they really captures this idea of a group that's all the same. You don't even have to name them as mackerel. What matters is they're functioning as some kind of unit. What I notice when I read the first stanza and get into the second and third is that there's a lot of kind of mathematical or metrical imagery. Parallel, rows, foot, divide, sections, and then later on the word template. So there's a lot of words that make me think of a grid or math class or something very quantitative and measured. Why might that be? Well, maybe it connects to what he's saying about what the fish represent and also just how the fish look and how their scales look when they are displayed on ice at a grocery store. Barred with black bands which divide the scales, radiant sections, like seams of lead in a Tiffany window, iridescent, watery. Now again, there's no periods here, right? We have to go down to the next stanza, but I'm just pausing here so I can talk about the particular stanzas. I noticed some alliteration with barred and black bands. If you've ever seen fish displayed at a grocery store, mackerel or a lot of other fish, it almost does look like a Tiffany window. The scales and then the black that you see behind them. It's a really beautiful and high contrast image, especially when you see the fish on top of white crushed ice. And by the way, here is what a Tiffany window looks like. It lets in light and filters in light in really beautiful ways. This particular example has a lot of that kind of iridescent, shimmering color like purples and pinks that you might see on the surface of a bubble or even a piece of really prismatic trash that's floating in the ocean. You can see how the fish do kind of look like a Tiffany window. We have words that suggest luminosity and brightness and color. So luminosity, radiant, iridescent, prismatics, abalone, rainbowed, soap bubble, sun on gasoline. It's a very specific image, isn't it? But we all know what he means. When you see sun sparkling on gasoline, which you've probably all seen at some point when you look in like a gutter, or even if you're at the gas station and there's a puddle somewhere with a couple drops of gas in it, or if you've just looked at a bubble, you know exactly what he's talking about. That weird fleeting quality of color where when you look at it one way, it looks pink. When you look at it from another angle, it looks kind of purpley. It's not a particular color in itself. It's what happens to the light, but he captures it so well. And of course, we see this on a fish's scales. It's a simile like seams of lead in a Tiffany window. And I think the reference to the Tiffany window is not only making us think of light, but it's also making us think of artistry. Later on, he's going to compare the fish to a jewel or a piece of jewelry that a master jeweler has spent countless hours working on. So there's some connection between the fish and art. And that also makes us think of a creator too, right? Some sort of artist who has created these beautiful fish, even though they're dead at the grocery store and they're about to be fried up or sauteed or steamed and eaten. I think the word iridescent is interesting. It comes back later in a different form, but like I said, it's not exactly a color. It's not exactly a quality of light. It's something really hard to define without using examples, say of a butterfly's wings or a dragonfly wings or a soap bubble. But I think this idea of angle and perspective is really important, right? It changes from different angles. We'll also talk about the word, or I also want to talk about the word prismatic. So prismatics itself is the poet turning the word prism or prismatic into a noun. So prismatic means of colors formed, separated, or distributed by an optical prism or something acting as one. And the root word there, prism, makes us think of some sort of glass object that distorts light or refracts light in interesting ways. But a prism can also be a lens, a way of viewing something from a different perspective. So I think now we're getting a hint that these fish have this really interesting iridescent quality, but he's calling our attention to perspective and understanding in a different way. Abalone shell, of course, you know what an abalone shell looks like on the inside and how it has that prismatic quality. I think what's noteworthy about some of these images is that some of them are pretty permanent, right? Like a Tiffany window, that's pretty permanent and something precious that you would see in a beautiful house or even a church. But soap bubble sphere, to me, makes me think of something that's fleeting, that's impermanent, that's only a bubble for a couple of seconds before it pops. So something fleeting. And the same thing with sun on gasoline. It's something that you see for a moment, but then you look again and you don't quite see that iridescent shimmer. So I think this idea of something temporary is going to be important when we get to the end of the poem. Sun on gasoline is also sort of an unexpected image to see in a poem. We wouldn't imagine something that you can see like looking into a gutter to be something beautiful, but here I think it's just so lovely. Splendor and splendor, and not a one in any way distinguished from the other. Somehow not a one seems very folksy to me, very conversational. And I think also the fact that the speaker is trying to tell us how to picture this, he's sort of teaching us how to interpret his poem as he describes the image. He says, okay, think abalone, think sun on gasoline. It makes it very conversational, as if he's working with us so that we can understand the image and then understand the metaphor. But even if we don't understand the metaphor, I think the images are beautiful enough that they can stand by themselves. Not in any way, or not a one in any way distinguished from one another. Nothing about them of individuality. Instead, they're all exact expressions of the one soul, each a perfect fulfillment of heaven's template. So again, we have that kind of mathematical, metrical imagery of template, kind of like rubric, something very formulaic, but it's heaven's template. So there's sort of a contrast between something that can be measured and quantified and it's on a grid versus something transcendent, something that we can't quite understand, heaven. And of course, of heaven's template, mackerel essence, when we think of essences or one perfect form, if you take in a basic philosophy class, you might know about Plato's form. And that's the idea that Plato had. This is much more complex in how I'm going to describe it, but the basic idea is that for any sort of object, like a chair or an animal, there exists a perfect version of that one object or thing or animal, and what we see on earth are just copies of that one perfect form. So here, he is alluding to Plato. As if after a lifetime arriving at this enameling, the jewelers made uncountable examples, each as intricate in its oily fabulation as the one before. I'm going to pause there, even though we're in the middle of a stanza. What I love about a lifetime of arriving at this enameling is that it makes us think of something that's both static, that's sort of frozen in time, kind of like the fish who are dead, but they appear to be lurching forward or swimming forward. So it's static, but it also evokes movement. A lifetime of arriving. How can you be arriving somewhere, getting to your destination for an entire lifetime? Well, that's kind of like what the fish are doing, right? They're both dead and static and yet moving forward. And maybe he's saying something about humanity there too. So now the fish are jewels or jewelry created by some sort of master jeweler who's made uncountable examples, each as intricate in its oily fabulation as the one before. So fabulation means the act of inventing fantastic tales. I think also fab makes us think of fabricating or creating something. And it's worth noting that fabulation is this idea that comes to us from a literary critic who wrote the book called The Fabulators. So, and it's kind of funny that his name is Shoals, which sounds a little bit like schools and also looks like the word school for fish, school of fish, which is spelled differently. Probably just a coincidence though. This is where we move from description to really a meditation on what it means to be alive and what it means to function as a unit and to kind of erase yourself in order to be part of a bigger unit or team or group. Suppose we could iridesse. Now, iridesse isn't a verb, but here he's using a neologism here. He's making up his own word. Suppose we could iridesse like these, like the fish, and lose ourselves entirely in the universe of shimmer. Now, I don't know exactly what that means for humans to lose themselves in the universe of shimmer, but I do know that if something shimmers, it kind of looks dynamic. It looks as if it's moving. It's also bright and fleeting and sparkly and appealing to the eye. So somehow we have to erase ourselves and lose ourselves into something bigger, the universe of shimmer. Maybe that means that humanity is sort of like a relay race and that our experiences or our suffering, they're not really about ourselves. They're part of just this endless relay race of humanity that we're all experiencing the same thing. But here he asks, okay, what if we could lose ourselves like these fish who are swimming in a school or who are displayed in a display case all together, one for one? Would you want to? Would you want to be yourself only, unduplicatable, doomed to be lost? They'd prefer plainly to be flashing participants. So would you want to be like these fish and be a flashing participant in some sort of group unit, or would you want to be yourself? I think most of us would want to be ourselves. I want to be awesome. I want to be a big fish in a big pond. I don't even want to be a big fish in a small pond. I want to be a big fish in a big pond. I want to be an awesome fish. I want to be like that fish from Fantasia that's really unique and interesting and beautiful. I don't want to be like all the other fish. But this poem is asking me to rethink that. Is there something beautiful and profound and maybe even more powerful to losing ourselves in this group, to losing ourselves in the school of fish? I think there's something, even though it might seem sort of anti-American or anti what we've been taught about individuality, there's something very comforting about this too, because it doesn't seem like it requires all that much work to do something that is luminous and bright and iridescent, but it requires some sort of erasing of our yearning to be individuals. Would you want to be yourself only, unduplicatable, doomed to be lost? They'd prefer, the fish, plainly, to be flashing participants. I love that image, flashing participants. Multitudinous. Okay, so I think the words that I'm kind of stumbling over, the first one, unduplicatable, doomed, there's a lot of hard D sounds, right? There's consonants there, and D is a pretty harsh sound. At least for me, it's hard to get out those words. It doesn't sound as positive, especially when paired with the word doomed and lost. But they prefer plainly to be flashing participants. We have more alliteration there with the beginning letters of the words plainly and participants. What does it mean to be a flashing participant? To me, when I picture this, I picture when you go to an aquarium and you see one of those cylindrical fish tanks, and the fish are swimming in a school, right, in some sort of circle, and as soon as they turn, all of a sudden they kind of change colors and they appear like one gigantic fish. In fact, that's why fish like mackerel swim in schools. Because they want to appear like one bigger fish, right, to scare off potential predators. But the flashing participant reminds me when all of a sudden the school of fish kind of changes direction, it looks totally different and gives off a different quality of light. It also, maybe it's because I'm a teacher, it makes me think of a bunch of hands going in the air, right, participants flashing their hands, and the individual answer doesn't matter so much. What matters is this collective, this working together. And somehow multitudinous, even though that's sort of a mouthful, I really like saying that. When it comes out of my mouth, it kind of makes me smile. Unlike the previous line, which is about individuality, but it makes it seem kind of depressing. And like you lose yourself in trying to be an individual anyway, so you might as well lose yourself in a good way in trying to be a member of this flashing group that's functioning as one. Let's talk about the enjambment here, because I think this gets to the how does form connect to content. So you might have noticed that the poem, even though it doesn't have a rhyme scheme, there is some rhyme, and you might notice that each stanza has 3 lines, and there's a space between each stanza. Each stanza is different, of course, but they're kind of like units, right? They're similar units because they're each 3 lines long. So kind of like the fish laid out on a stark white icy background, sort of the same thing here with the stanzas, right? They're each one stanza, they're all a little bit different, but they're working together as some sort of unit. I think a more convincing example of how form connects to content is here. When it says, even now they seem to be bolting forward, heedless of stasis. This is an example of enjambment. Very few of the lines in this poem are end-stopped, right? Very few of the lines or stanzas end with a full stop or a period, right? A lot of times we have to skip down to the next line or even skip down to the next stanza. Bolting forward, the fact that bolting ends at the end of that stanza and that line, and we're forced to go forward or to move down to the next stanza, is a perfect example of how this enjambment technique can connect the form, right, or this technique here to the content. It makes us think of this idea of bolting forward because we are bolting forward or jumping down as we're reading the poem, right? We don't get to have a nice long pause after the word bolting. We have to skip down to the next stanza, just like the fish. So they're bolting forward, heedless of stasis. Again, that tension between being static and being dynamic, being alive and being dead, functioning as one versus being a unit. So they are simultaneously moving forward, but staying where they are. They don't care that they're dead and nearly frozen, just as presumably they didn't care that they were living. All for all for all. So somehow this line to me seems a little bit funny, even though it's kind of dark. After all, he's talking about dead fish that are going to be eaten. It also makes me think of the slogan from the Three Musketeers, all for all. And there's something sort of kind of folksy and also almost like something you would hear in, say, kindergarten or preschool, right? Like, oh, we're doing this together. We're doing this as a team. There's something maybe naive about it, but something kind of simplistic and nice about it too. And I think that connects to the language, this kind of schoolyard language in the next stanza. The rainbowed school and its acres of brilliant classrooms in which no verb is singular. Now, I think here he must be playing with school, as in an academic institution, and school of fish. Now, obviously the spelling is different, but since we were just talking about fish acting as a unit, when we see that word school spelled differently, we can't help but think of a school of fish. Classroom, same thing. No verb is singular, or everyone is. So it's sort of this either or. It seems like those two things couldn't be farther apart, and yet they're kind of the same. So a singular verb would be something like, I walk to the market, right? Or she walks to the market. Just one person doing one thing. The verb is singular. A plural verb, right? They walk to the market or I walk to the market is suggesting a bunch of people are doing the same thing. But it also makes us think of grammar class or English class or being in school. There's something kind of academic about the language there. It's also worth noting that everyone, as one word, is technically a singular indefinite pronoun, but most of us, when we're speaking informally, we use it as if it's plural, but technically it's a singular indefinite pronoun, right? That's why we should say everyone is blah, 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 because it's a singular indefinite pronoun. So maybe there's a little bit of a joke there. So no verb is singular because they're all functioning as a team. They're a they. Think back to the pronoun that begins the poem, they. Or every verb is singular, but they're all doing the same thing. They're all singular verbs. So again, it seems like those two things are totally antithetical, but actually it's kind of the same theme of unity. Even if every verb is singular, well, they're all connected in the fact that they're all singular. They're all using the same type of verb. How happy they seem, even on ice, to be together, selfless, which is the price of gleaming. Love that last line, the price of gleaming. Who wouldn't want to gleam? I would like to gleam. Do I know exactly what it means to gleam as a human? Do I know exactly how to translate what he's saying about the fish, the metaphor of the fish, into humanity and the relay race of humanity? Not quite, but like something gleaming or iridescent, you can only kind of see it for a second at a certain angle. That's how I kind of connect to the poem. I get it kind of, but then as soon as I think I grasp what it means to be a gleaming human, I kind of lose the idea. I also think ending on an image like gleaming is really powerful and very visual, and certainly gleaming has a positive connotation. But the word price suggests that there is a cost, right? There is some sort of debt that you must pay or price to this gleaming, to this transcendence that you get through being part of the group. But when I read this poem, I kind of want to pay the price. I'm willing to pay the price if there's a chance of this type of gleaming. I hope you had the chance to watch the video that I posted on the previous page in which he talks about this poem and what he was going through and how he was at the grocery store and how he had recently lost his partner to AIDS when he wrote this poem. I think that adds another layer of meaning. But of course, I always think it's good to read the poem, the text first, before listening to what the author has to say. I think noting what he says about metaphor is really worthwhile. It's something that you can even try in your own life. He says that he comes across these images and he doesn't know what their metaphor is for yet, and then he figures out why the metaphor speaks to him. So on a different day, he could have gone to the grocery store and seen these same fish, but they might have represented something totally different. I really love his ideas about metaphor. I hope you enjoyed this poem, and I hope that you're able to connect it to the next poem that we're going to read, which is quite different, but also has the fish image, Mirror by Sylvia Plath.